This meeting is being recorded.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our next instalment in our presentations for the ADR Research Network Roundtable, which is being jointly organised this year by myself and my colleague, Professor Rachel Field, here at Bond University. We're very glad to have, as our next presenter this morning, Dr. Grant Morris, who is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Law at Victoria University, Wellington. And so I'll hand over to Grant to present to us for the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a short discussion with the people who have joined us here on Zoom today. So Grant, it's over to you.
Tēnā koutou. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, people who have come to listen to this talk, and also for the opportunity to be part of the roundtable. I've often watched it from afar, but never been personally part of it. So it's great to engage with it this year and to share my ideas as they are at the moment. What I want to talk about for the next 20 minutes or so is a paper I'm working on, which looks at the impact of the COVID pandemic on New Zealand's dispute resolution system. And I want to draw out some of the key themes, just give you an idea of what I'm covering. It's partially written at the moment, so in the sense of being a work in progress and getting feedback on a work in progress, and this is very good timing for me. The idea came out of a report that we put together at the beginning of last year as part of our summer research, summer scholarship program. And it was looking at the impact of the pandemic on dispute resolution in different jurisdictions around the world and in New Zealand also, but trying to gather together what information we had after a year of the crisis to see how had different regimes reacted, adapted, and coped, partly to get some ideas for what we could or should be doing in New Zealand. So that report was put together, and at that stage information was really just becoming available, looking back and analysing what had occurred in the previous year. But of course, January 2021 is still very much in the midst of the crisis, and a lot has happened since then. So this particular paper is focusing on New Zealand. It still has that overseas context to help out, and so we can do some comparisons, but it's on New Zealand and it's on our experience and things that have occurred and learnings that we can take from that. The ultimate question that the paper seeks to address really is it going to be possible to return to dispute resolution pre-COVID or pre-March 2020? And if so, is it even desirable, or to what extent is it desirable to do so? So that's really where the paper is heading towards, is a view on that. Of course, the crisis is still not over. We still have closed borders, not for too much longer in New Zealand, but we have restrictions. But we're now 2 years into the crisis, and dispute resolution regimes in New Zealand have had to adapt. And we have some good case studies that we can use to explore this topic. So I'll begin by giving the March 2020 state of play, and you'll be able to get an idea of where New Zealand was at that point, and then what happened. And I'll link it to some work that we've done previously as well. So in the book that Annabelle Shaw and I wrote and published in May 2018, Mediation in New Zealand, we had a chapter on online dispute resolution. And we, just to very quickly quote, we said, it's clearly a feature of our dispute resolution landscape, but it is one that New Zealand is not currently utilising, or at least not utilising very much. It has a place and it should be part of our landscape. And through that chapter, we went on to say that there's a lot of potential, but it's not really being utilised in New Zealand, not even first generation ODR in most cases. So this is in relation to mediation specifically. So it doesn't take into account what we might call conciliation or the more hybrid consumer complaints type of regimes that we're using it more. So it was what we would conventionally understand as mediation that we were referring to. And what we were suggesting is that, you know, it's time to really start utilizing this technology, not just for the sake of utilizing technology, but rather it's there and we should be integrating it into our systems and into our regimes. That was the idea. And then less than 2 years after, New Zealand goes into lockdown, and all of these dispute resolution regimes have to adapt to social distancing and different types of delivery. So there wasn't a lot of change, I must say, between May 2018 and March 2020. Maybe not enough people read our book, but definitely things started to happen quickly. So in terms of the parameters of this paper, as much as possible, I wanted to keep it wide so I could talk about, you know, the impact on the court system and the impact on what we might call conciliation. I have read ADRAC's latest report on conciliation. It's fascinating, and especially relating it to New Zealand. But I do make a distinction, as you're doing now in Australia, or have done in Australia, with this distinction between mediation and conciliation. Most of the paper that I've written so far has been on mediation, as we would conventionally understand it. And that's just reflecting, I suppose, my main research focus. But there is, you know, there's a wider picture as well. And because of the impact and the way the crisis impacted, you know, you can't really look at one without the other. You can't look at the impact on the courts without understanding, well, what did that mean for, you know, mediation and so on. So on the eve of lockdown in March 2020 in New Zealand, some of the regimes were better placed than others to be able to adapt. And some really weren't placed at all to adapt. And I want to weave in 4 main case studies to my paper and just briefly touch on in the talk today. And they are our employment mediation service, our family dispute resolution service, which is custody disputes, and our private commercial mediation market, and finally our residential tenancies mediation and conciliation service. And they all have different experiences in what's occurred in New Zealand from March 2020 to today. And I think we can learn a lot about ODR and different types of delivery from that. Some of the paper as well is drawn on my personal experience. So I'm a researcher, teacher, but I also do some practitioner work as well. And in particular was helping out with the employment mediation service moving online and dealing with the backlog that COVID had created. So I got a wonderful opportunity to have a close view of what was changing in that area. So in March 2020, New Zealand went into one of the world's strictest lockdowns. So pretty much stay-at-home orders, social distancing, only essential services running. Unlike, as I understand it, many parts of Australia, we closed down construction and areas of the economy like that. We really were just left with the bare basics for 2 months. Between mid-March and mid-May 2020. The courts, first and foremost, were affected by having to move online and not really being set up to be able to do that quickly. So the backlog that already occurred was exacerbated. And some of the mediation services were drastically affected as well. So when I talk about the lockdowns in New Zealand, it's played out differently in New Zealand to other countries. And we've had 2 main lockdowns: the March to May 2020 lockdown, which was a very strict nationwide lockdown. And then things, as you probably know, opened up again. And while our borders were closed, New Zealand itself continued in a fairly normal way because we had managed to eliminate COVID temporarily eliminate COVID. Our second lockdown, which is very important for what I'm trying to do with this article, happened with Delta coming to New Zealand in August 2021. And outside Auckland, that lasted only for a few weeks, that lockdown, but in Auckland, it lasted for 3.5 months. So it was a long lockdown in Auckland. So the second lockdown is really the Auckland lockdown. And gives us an opportunity to compare, or to see what regimes and providers had learned in the 15 intervening months between lockdown 1 and lockdown 2. So when lockdown 1 occurred, let me start with just an example from our employment mediation service. So our employment mediation service conducts approximately half of all mediations in any given year in New Zealand, and has done for the last 20 years. It is by far our busiest mediation provider. It's run nearly, the vast majority of mediations are run by the government's mediation service, which is free. And up until COVID, its reputation was rested on the fact that this was a dynamic, robust, in-person service. About 96% of all mediations were done in person, either being 4-hour or 8-hour slots. So relatively long in-person experiences, 4,000 to 5,000 mediations a year. The 4% approximately that weren't done on in person were done by telephone. So of course, online technology was there, Zoom was there, and Microsoft Teams and video conferencing had been there for some time, but it wasn't really being utilized, and it wasn't ready to go in March 2020, and the mediators weren't trained to do it. So when lockdown happened, the entire employment mediation service went to telephone and stayed on telephone during the lockdown. Now I know, or I understand in Australia that a lot of employment mediation is done by telephone. So for Australia, that wouldn't sound surprising. But for our mediation service and employment, it was a huge shift. And a few things happened. The first thing is that a lot of users and their representatives didn't want to do telephone, and so said, we'll wait until lockdown's finished. And so a big backlog occurred with the service as people waited until the restrictions were lifted so they could do in-person mediation again. That backlog was exacerbated by all of the new employment disputes that were occurring because of COVID and the legislative changes and employment changes that occurred because of that. So coming out of lockdown in May 2020, there's a big backlog to deal with. Now, during that intervening 15 months before the next lockdown, the employment service had the opportunity to upskill its mediators to be able to provide online mediation, and was able to use that time. That said, during that period, it effectively went back to a in-person service. So 2-month lockdown, we're back in person again for 15 months for the most part. Then in August 2021, another lockdown. This time the service is ready to go on Zoom, and it becomes effectively an online service, and it has remained so for the last 6 months. So time is important here for my argument in this article, because my theory, I suppose, is that the longer we endure these changes, the more likely they are to stick. We can see with the 2-month lockdown to begin with, the changes didn't really stick. It was too short. People said, no, we'll just wait until things go back to normal. But now we're 6 months since the second lockdown began, and most of the employment mediation is being done by Zoom. And it's more likely, I think, to stick this time. So that's one example. Another example is the private commercial mediation market. And for those of you who know the work I've been doing over the last few years, I've been mapping out our private commercial mediation market in New Zealand through doing empirical work. And so I'm able to have an idea of approximately how much is going on, who's doing it, the nature of that mediation. So we're talking about mediation that exists outside the government regimes, think construction, insurance mediation, and contractual disputes in business. So like employment, the private commercial mediation market was almost put on hold during the first lockdown. There was a bit of online, there was a bit of attempts to do telephone, but really people said, we'll wait. And so come May 2020, everyone's back in person again. And that seemed to be what people wanted, what the market was demanding. And again, that continued for 15 months, domestic market, people flying around, doing in-person mediations. But when the second lockdown hits in August 2021, particularly because it's Auckland focused, our main commercial hub, then online becomes a thing, and online is the norm, and online continues to be the norm in many cases, because even though we're no longer in lockdown, our Omicron restrictions are such that a lot of New Zealanders have put themselves into self-lockdown. I think a similar thing might have happened in Australia with Omicron. And so again, it seems that the second lockdown, not only did it give regimes and markets time to prepare to deliver more robust online DR, but also it's made it more likely that these changes will endure in New Zealand, because both employment and commercial very much in-person regimes before COVID. After COVID, it may well be that they become primarily online regimes, because what people are finding, as we've seen in similar places around the world, is savings in travel, savings in parking and time and cost, and just the ability to be able to mediate or from your office or even from home. So there's those advantages that people are finding, and then they get weighed up against the disadvantages of that lack of contact, that lack of human contact, that Zoom rigidity, which I think we've all probably experienced doing whole day mediations or half day mediations on Zoom, and it's tiring. It's, I think, more tiring personally than doing in-person mediations, and digital divide as well. The fact that not everyone has a solid and reliable internet connection, that definitely is improving in New Zealand. But just to point out in this paper that not all regimes experience the pandemic in a similar way, there's two examples which differ. Now, the first one is our family dispute resolution mediation service. So these are custody disputes. So if employment mediation makes up approximately half of all mediations in New Zealand, commercial might be another 20%, family might be another 25%, just give you a rough idea of the numbers. And so this is an important service that mediators contract to the government to provide. And some of the providers were already set up with online capability and training. So they were able to pivot during the first lockdown and offer that to their users. And so they were, some of them, not all of them, some of them were in a better position than the employment mediation service and private commercial mediators. They'd already seen, well, they were harnessing the technology that was there before the other two examples I've given you, and obviously continued to use it as well. So that's an example of an area which was more ready than the two I've discussed at more length. But another example I want to provide is the residential tenancies. It's really a conciliation service, right? It calls itself a mediation service, but I think in an Australian context, you'd call it a conciliation service. It's completely modelled on the South Australian Residential Tenancies Act, almost a carbon copy, if you know that act. And it's mainly short dispute resolution by phone around rent arrears, but they moved to telephone 15 years ago. They were very much an in-person service, but they moved to telephone 15 years ago. And so when COVID hit, nothing changed. They just continued to operate as they always had done. But the fascinating thing is the tenancy mediators share offices with the employment mediators and the government around New Zealand. And so half the offices is in chaos as they try and adapt in-person mediation to something different. And then the other half of the office is just completely business as usual in terms of delivery. So I found that fascinating to see. So I think I'm coming too near to the end of the 20 minutes, and hopefully that's given you a bit of an idea about where we're at. Some of the, just a few more points and then I'll finish. One of the interesting points, and the data is starting to come in from some overseas jurisdictions, is whether the COVID restrictions and the pressure on the courts has led to an increase in mediation, conciliation, consensual third-party forms of dispute resolution. We know it's changed the landscape. We know it's changed delivery, but has it meant more? I don't have an answer. I mean, I do have an answer in some areas, like in employment. It's been roughly consistent once the backlog was sorted out. But I know that there's information coming in from overseas, so that's an important question: is the amount. Also, of course, the effectiveness of online. You know, there's user satisfaction surveys that we have, but how effective is what we're doing? It's because we've trained someone to mediate on Zoom. Does that mean that they're getting as good a service as they were under the in-person model? I mean, these are pivotal questions as we decide post-pandemic, which is hopefully coming up soon, whether to move back to the in-person model again. You know, there's going to become a moment, a very important moment, where these regimes and these providers have to decide, do we want to stick with what's changed? You know, can we? And the answer is probably yes. You know, once the restrictions are lifted, and hopefully that'll be in a few months, then we can go back to what was. The question then becomes, do we want to go back to what was? Or perhaps more specifically, to what extent do we want to go back to what was? And as I said, my argument, I suppose, is that the longer this has gone on, particularly the lockdowns, the more likely it is that these changes will stick, and that this will be the, to use that much used and overused term, the new normal, that these changes will become the normal way of delivering, in particular, mediation in New Zealand. So it'll go from mediation in New Zealand being, for most people, an in-person experience pre-March 2020, to, for most people, an online experience once we come out of this these pandemic restrictions. So that's where I'm at anyway. That's about 20 minutes, and it's great to be able to kind of voice these ideas that are still kind of circulating in my head and circulating through that partially finished paper. So thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Grant, for that presentation. It's a fascinating insight, I think, into a challenge which affects not only New Zealand, but certainly Australia as well, and indeed an international issue at present. Now, I notice Rachel has her hand up to immediately jump in with a question or comment.
So that wasn't clapping. Rachel. I was just clapping. But I did, thank you, Grant. It's fascinating, and it's really interesting to share different experiences in different jurisdictions, which is really great. We've got Lawrence and Alison with us though, so I might defer to things that they may want to say, because I know Lawrence does a lot of online employment workplace stuff. So do you want to, and Alison's whole PhD thesis was about effectiveness of mediation. So over to you guys.
I think you're still muted, Lawrence.
I was offering Alison to go, but didn't realise that I was muted. That was terrific. Grant, thank you so much. Just 3 comments. Mine is not systematic like yours. It's very, very anecdotal. I think the first one is the law of inertia, I think, is going to be so powerful, which you touched on. There's so many economic drivers. I mean, almost everything these days is driven by economics, unfortunately. And what this has done is it's shifted the cost and risk from the organisation in part to the individual. So we've all had to set up at home and in the office and so on and so on. And that's the business model that's been used in fast food and everywhere, that shift of cost and risk. Just in relation to the performance factors, it's quite interesting how, and you touched on this quite a lot in terms of the shift from one modality to the other. In one agency I work for with Zoom, or about to use Teams actually, they offered training by NIDA, which is the National Institute of Dramatic Art. So we had 3 hours training on presentation. But the consumers, which meant effectively the lawyers, they didn't take up Teams. So that's all done by phone. But there is a kind of a performance issue there. But at the anecdotal level, and it really picks up on your point, I just think the flexibility, the use of screen share, I use cartoons, negotiation matrices, conditional link bargaining, shading and so on. I mean, it's just an extraordinary facility. And the drafting, execution, and exchange, of the deed at the end it's just done in minutes. So I think it's a really. I'm not saying we shouldn't go back in person, but I think it's going to be hard to replicate that where everything is driven by efficiency. And then just finally, which I think you're kind of touching on, is I think we're going to go to mixed mode with a bit of in-person, a bit of text-based. I use quite a lot of text-based, particularly with council. I'm texting them all the time, plus phone, plus email, plus the Zoom, of course. And, I've even done telephone stuff from the car, so I think it's that multi-mode stuff which I suspect will be a driver. But I liked your very systematic approach, particularly those case studies. They're fascinating how there's a start, a finish, and then sometimes a kind of a revisioning at the second lockdown.
Well, thanks, Lawrence. Yeah, and thanks for those ideas, and definitely that shifting cost one is an interesting one because some of these changes are being particularly driven by the people who run the organisations. They can see efficiencies that can be saved, and the viewpoint from the actual mediators is well, from what I can tell, is mixed. I've talked to a few groups in New Zealand about how they're finding these changes, and it really is split. Some people like online mediation and find that they prefer it. Sometimes because of they actually prefer the experience. Sometimes not necessarily prefer the experience, but it's just so much more efficient for them that they prefer it in person. And then there is a good number of people who just don't want to do online. At some point, I think they are going to have to adapt to the fact that if one wants to, be a dispute resolution practitioner in the future, they're going to have to do some online.
Alison, I wonder if you had any thoughts based on your experiences.
I have a range of concerns about online mediation and probably conciliation as well, and possibly even arbitration. And it has to do with the complexities that three-dimensional in-person context gives to the whole thing. And rather than go into that, last week I conducted or co-conducted a 4-day mediation intensive with everyone in the room. So all the students were in the room. And what kept going through my mind was how different this was from doing the conference last September, where everything was online. Despite every possible effort to make the conference the best possible experience, it was still online. And it still missed out on that sense that you get with people in a room of all the different things going on in the room, not just the Zoom square. And I've stored all that away, and I'm still running it round in my head. What actually are the differences, and how are those? Do you quantify them or measure them? But it's interesting. It was completely different. And in part, it could be because our brains are set up for the three-dimensional experience and respond more completely to that than they can to the square sitting on a screen in front of it. I'm not sure. We know that when people read a book compared with when they read something on a screen, there is much greater comprehension of reading in a physical book than reading on screen. And I imagine there's something to be extrapolated there. Right? I find the whole area very interesting. Obviously, I wouldn't have done what I did last year with the conference. So I think it's very interesting that Grant is actually looking at all this.
Well, thanks, Alison. Yeah, I think the jury's still out on the effectiveness of online and how we actually compare it to in person. What criteria are we using? How do we actually do that comparison? I mean, at a very superficial level, what some of the regimes are doing in New Zealand is comparing settlement rates. So we have the answer there, or employment at least, is that the settlement rates are roughly the same for online. One of the interesting things in employment, though, is there are really two main categories, if you like, of type of mediation you're going to be faced with. One is a fairly transactional dismissal, person leaving, exit type mediation, usually the shorter type of mediation. And online it appears to not have a particularly significant difference than in person because of that transactional nature of it. The other main type is an ongoing relationship where the person is still in the workplace. They may well stay in the workplace. There's a lot of often more transformative elements to the mediation. Can you effectively replicate that online, especially if it is a 6 to 8 hour mediation? At the moment, they have no choice because the whole thing's online pretty much. But when we get more of a choice, maybe it's that we go back to in-person for particular types of disputes and we stay online for others, so it's triaged. And there is a triage unit within the employment mediation service, so that work can be done. So fitting the forum to the fuss and so on, but maybe it is about saying, well, what is the nature of this mediation? What suits best?
Grant, just on that point, I think one thing that I've noticed in the clinic work that we do here at the Bond Dispute Resolution Centre, which is a family dispute resolution clinic, the biggest impact that I've seen in terms of online affecting the dynamics and atmosphere of a mediation lies around apology. So, I've seen some in-person apologies just be so strong in changing almost the atoms in the air, and then being a massive, turning of a corner in a discussion between two people over their children. And then online, I've seen it just, not have that same effect. So I think, that's at least one thing that I've noticed. Lawrence, do you notice apology in the context where you're mediating impacted by being online? Sorry, you're on mute.
Mute myself. No, I haven't picked that up, but I can understand the point. I can, but no, personally, I haven't picked it up. No.
Yeah, but I think though as well, Grant, that it's, I think that one of the reasons why the family dispute resolution people could adapt more readily, I think that was something that you said that they were more ready to do, because we have already been using sort of shuttle and online approaches for safety and telephone mediations as well for safety reasons in that context. So I guess that's a contextual issue as well that adds to. Point. Yeah. But yes, there's definitely something intangible that can be in person. But on the other hand, I think, the safety issues, but also accessibilities, people can really access this. And when you're weighing these things in the balance, does that intangible content outweigh the benefit of being able to have somebody from Perth talking to somebody in Sydney with a mediator in Brisbane. You know, there is so much convenience and greater accessibility. And I think particularly for rural and remote people, this is going to be an important thing for the future too.
Yeah, and especially with the distances in Australia as well. And the I mean, one thing that's fascinating about doing this work as well is the unforeseen spin-offs or consequences. And one might be the creation of a more significant private employment mediation market, because if let's say the government service remains primarily online, but some representatives and parties want in person, well, they can find that in the private market. You can still do employment mediation and have it confirmed under the Act in the private market. So the private market's been very small historically, but anecdotal evidence suggests that it's growing. And that's definitely something I want to research in more depth as well, is that, you know, you make a choice saying, well, we're going to deliver in this way, but if people say, well, we don't necessarily want that, we're going to seek delivered in another way, what does that mean for the market and for, you know, opportunities for DR in New Zealand?
Yeah, that's true. So I guess in the interest of time, we should wrap up, but just wondering, does anybody else want to make a comment before we do that?
I was just going to comment, but it seems like this is really an area where there's a need for more qualitative research in order to try and pin down what the differences are, if any, for everybody in the room about the different modes of mediation that we're experiencing these days.
Yes, so look, thank you so much, Grant, for bringing New Zealand into our roundtable this year. It's great that we've been able to include you for the roundtable this year, and hopefully in the future, if we do go back to in-person roundtables, we'll be multimodal so that we can have you with us again. Thanks, Alison and Lawrence, for joining us as well, and your wonderful comments and expertise and insights as always. Thank you, John, for co-convening. And we just hope that everyone will shift the discussion to the blog now and continue that online. And we will continue with these weekly posts and send out messages when they're available. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.